Hello and welcome to today's WorkSafe Month webinar, The Path Back from Isolation, Enhancing Employee Wellbeing and Performance Post-COVID-19. I'm Stephanie Morawski from WorkSafe Tasmania and I will be your moderator. Before we start, please take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. I'll now go over housekeeping. Here is a screenshot of the attendee control panel. You should see something that looks like this on the right hand of your screen. You're likely listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to listen over the phone, please select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Webcams and audience microphones will not be used in today's presentation. Questions will be taken throughout the presentation. Please use your control panel to type and submit your questions. An attendee handout is now also available for download via your handouts window. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded. I would now like to introduce your presenter, Dr. Kimberley Norris from the University of Tasmania. Professor Norris is a psychological scientist and clinical psychologist who works across academic, research and clinical practice settings. Her overarching research and academic interests are focused on maximising human health, well-being and performance in both normal and extreme environments. Her research interests include adaptation and resilience in both extreme environments, for example, Antarctica, space and FIFO, and more normative environments such as academic. Through her work, Kimberley develops new and innovative ways to provide psychological support for individuals in remote, rural, maritime and extreme environments at an individual, organisational and relationship level. Welcome, Kimberley.
Thank you, Stephanie. So today's webinar is around the very real experience that we are currently navigating post-COVID-19 and the awareness we all have that workplaces are tasked with building a culture of psychological safety. And through that process, we enhance our capability, our survival. Ultimately, we really want to thrive as a result of these experiences. So as Stephanie's already indicated, you're very welcome to ask questions throughout the webinar, or of course, wait until the end as well. I've just provided some additional contact information should there be any further queries based on today's webinar. So one thing I think that could be really helpful for us to learn a little more about who we are today, but also some of the factors that are impacting us, is to complete a couple of really brief online surveys or polls. So if you can enter that link, now obviously it's quite a long one, but I'll give you a couple of moments. This is really a poll that's designed to help us understand where your workforce is currently located. Do you work remotely? Do you work on site? Or is it a blended model of the two? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to complete that first poll. For those of you who've had a chance to complete that first poll, you need to think about the impacts of COVID-19 on your workplace. From the results that are coming in, we've got a range of different work scenarios. Some people working remotely, some people working on site, many experiencing a blended experience. And for some, there's been a mixture of both positive and more challenging impacts of COVID-19 on the workplace. Others have been more beneficial. One of the reasons I wanted to start thinking about positive and potentially challenging impacts of COVID-19 on the workplace is because, generally speaking, when most people are thinking about, talking about the impacts of COVID-19, they're understandably focusing on the negative. However, what we do know is that whatever event, be it another event, nothing is ever 100% positive, nor 100% negative. And so by recognizing that there can be both positive and negative at the same time and in response to the same event, that actually is a really important consideration and one that shapes the way that we work with our workforce. So the research that I've had the privilege to undertake with a range of different workplaces has made quite clear that there can be very many and varied impacts of isolation. And some of these impacts of isolation, and when I talk about isolation, I guess in many ways people would automatically think of when people were experiencing lockdowns associated with COVID-19, but it is more broad than that. For those individuals working remotely, isolation may be that continued separation, physically at least, from others with whom they need to engage in a regular way, on a regular basis. The growth outcomes associated with isolation, so the good things that can emerge, include things like having more time available, or at least greater flexibility of time available to perhaps engage in activities that we might not otherwise find time for. Most people, most of the time, are so very busy and have so many competing commitments that their ability to engage in things like thinking about who they are and what's important to them may not often occur. However, when in isolation and when some of those demands, at least in terms of commuting, have reduced, and when, if you like, the noise of everyday life that we often navigate through, so the interaction with other people, navigating society, when we don't need to worry about that, or at least not to the same degree, it does free up that space to think about who am I, what's important, and interestingly and importantly, how do my actions align with those values? And the opportunity to think about this, what's important to me and why is it important to me, then helps us develop new perspectives about ourselves, about the world around us, and even where to from here. And so that's why we are seeing, for example, post-return from isolation, some people actually making quite big differences to their everyday lives. And these differences, these changes, are designed to better align our actions with our values. Now, for those of you who did experience a period of lockdown with perhaps a few others, this might not immediately ring true. In the short term, we do know that people become very frustrated with others, mainly because there's no escape. But in the longer term, when you've experienced isolation, particularly prolonged isolation, then people actually demonstrate much greater tolerance towards others and towards everyday hassles, life stresses. And because of that increased tolerance to weather the everyday, if you like, it leaves more in reserve to cope with challenges of larger events if and when they occur. The other thing that we find quite consistently following experience of isolation is an enhanced commitment to self-care. That does align with a range of the other aspects, particularly that idea of aligning personal values with behaviours. And so many people will say things like, rather than spending half an hour in the car in the morning, I went for a walk instead, or I read a book, or I sat and had a coffee and ate my breakfast in a more relaxed way. And those types of activities that help to rest, relax, and re-energize us are so vital to our health, well-being, and performance. And yet they're one of the first things that often go by the wayside when we become overwhelmed and when time pressures start to exert their influence on our everyday activities. Now, another component that often happens alongside all of this, and it's related to self-care, it's related to identity exploration, is the fact that people have the opportunity, maybe even simply the time, to try new things. And through this exploration, through this trying of new things, they learn more about themselves. And once we know more about ourselves, we know how to support optimal functioning. So again, it leads back to this idea. If we know the things that help to rest, relax, and energize us, we can commit to integrating these into our lives and therefore having an overall enhanced quality of life. So long story short, what the research very clearly tells us is that the impacts of isolation not only can be beneficial in the short term, but can actually be quite beneficial in the long term. And this idea of essentially having to weather a challenge to achieve higher functioning aligns really strongly with psychological constructs of growth. So this idea that until we're pushed beyond our pre-existing limits, we actually don't know how well we can function. And that, that's a really hopeful message, and it's a very powerful message. But I think we'd all be very naive to think that everything about isolation is good. We know for a fact it isn't. It wouldn't be challenging. So alongside those positive impacts that can be both short and longer term in nature are a range of challenges that also can be both short and longer term in nature. One of the biggest factors relevant to the workplace environment is that for a wide variety of reasons, the workplace can serve as a very important component of a person's sense of self, their identity, and a form of escape from other aspects of their lives. And so to have been in a position where people could not engage with that workplace, could not engage in those strategies, then what happens is people start to question and have difficulty with who am I? Do I fit? And where do I belong? As a result, some people will experience declines in their mental health and well-being if they experience this loss of identity and loss of escape that the workplace can so importantly provide. The other aspect to remember in this particular consideration is when people primarily define themselves as an employee rather than anything else, or maybe the exclusion of everyone else, to not have access to the workplace to fulfill that sense of identity can further compound those difficulties. As a result, mood fluctuations, particularly irritability and anxiety, happen quite regularly. People essentially experience a roller coaster of emotions where some days are better than others, some parts of the day are better than others. And sometimes it can seem really unpredictable as to what constitutes a good day and what constitutes a not so good day. So understanding that these mood fluctuations, these roller coasters of emotion are normal is really, really important. And it's actually a very, very powerful message that we need to give our employees. That if people are struggling in any way at the moment, we consider this a completely normal reaction to a very abnormal environment. And whilst that doesn't change the situation, it doesn't change the challenge, what it does do is reassure people that there's not something inherently wrong with them that means they're not coping. And similarly, it gives a form of permission to identify when things are not going as well as people would hope or want. The thing about isolation, the thing about pandemics and other forms of stresses is that it doesn't only affect mood. It also affects other aspects of psychological functioning. And one in particular I'm going to focus on is the idea of cognitive load. So essentially, every single one of us has a finite cognitive capacity, a limit to how much our brain can do at any one time. And for most of us, most of the time, we're skating quite close to our limit. When we think about our work commitments, our home commitments, our hobbies, there's not a lot of buffer zone left over. So when you then add another large-scale stressor, like a pandemic, and associated mitigation strategies like isolation, what happens is that people are likely to exceed their cognitive capacity as a result of increased cognitive load. Now, our brain is an incredible organ, but again, it's not infallible. So what it has to do is make decisions about what things do I need to keep doing and what things can I put less effort and energy towards to keep functioning. And this is why during isolation, during the pandemic, and even now, people will say things like, my memory is just not as good as it used to be. I seem to need to write things down, or I need to put them in my diary, or it just doesn't happen. They'll talk about decreased attention and concentration ability, that it takes them much longer to problem solve. So to identify what the issue is, the range of options available to act, and then to actually implement that plan takes a lot longer. And similarly, even just that process of thinking through things, the processing speed seems to slow down. And people will typically talk about exhaustion. Just, I'm tired nearly all the time. And may even say, I can't understand why. The reason is because of this increased cognitive load and resultant overload of our cognitive capacity. Thinking takes energy. Emotional processing takes energy. So the exhaustion people describe is very real, but can be hard to place because normally when we think of being tired, we think about physical exertion rather than mental exertion. And again, discussing this impact of cognitive load has been a really important one I've found across a number of places, because most people have this aha moment of, oh goodness, I thought there was something wrong with me because I just wasn't as efficient, I couldn't remember things. Now I realise there's a reason. And that idea of a reason is so powerful. When people can understand that there is a reason for their experience, that in and of itself helps them to feel the world is more predictable. And when the world is more predictable, then they feel more in control. Those things combined can decrease anxiety. So whilst this knowledge doesn't change the nature of the experience, what it does change is the way you perceive it. And that perceptions are really important, because another one of the challenges of isolation is that when we're removed from that workplace context, we lose social comparisons that we normally rely on to gauge how well we're travelling in terms of our efficiency, in terms of our performance, in terms of general expectations. And, you know, we have the luxury of have a corridor conversation or just briefly to chat to someone or just sort of scan the office. What's happen is that people start to come to their own conclusions about expectations that are held on them. And this is particularly for those people who are perfectionists, because without those social cues, that they normally rely on to reassure themselves that they're going okay, are much more at risk of engaging in overcompensation. So doing longer hours, more work in an effort to try and compensate for their perceived shortcomings. And as a result, they're at increased risk of burnout. When people experience burnout, this is not just a temporary decline in their health, well-being, and performance, but actually can have much longer lasting impacts, including disengagement from the workspace. As a result, what we find is that we might misinterpret this disengagement as a form of procrastination, when in fact it's evidence of overwork to the point where people have burned themselves out. We find that the impact of these loss of social comparators and cues is particularly strong on people who feel vulnerable in the workplace. And that vulnerability might be due to things like being relatively early in their career, being from a minority. And when I speak about minorities, that doesn't necessarily have to be racial or religious or cultural, but it could even be gender-based, depending on the work environment. Now, as a result of these highs and lows that go along with the isolation experience, coming back to broader society can be quite challenging. And historically, people underestimate this challenge because the idea is that the danger's past, or the worst part is over, the isolation ended. However, the reality is that what we call reintegration, which occurs when people are re-entering a previously familiar environment, there are actually further changes, further adjustments, and further adaptations that are needed in order to successfully navigate this next phase of the isolation experience. And I talk about that quite deliberately. Isolation is not just about that time when people are physically distanced from one another. It actually spans post-return until the new normal has been developed. So what you'll see from the screen at the moment is that there are peaks and troughs, highs and lows, and that this roller coaster of emotions that often accompanies isolation continues throughout reintegration. And in fact, this is such a well-known phenomenon that it's actually been given the term reverse culture shock. And it's that whole idea that our brain is trying to tell us, you should know what to do here. This should be second nature. We've been here before. However, the reality is that we've not actually been here before. The environment has changed in terms of the physical environment, the social environment, and the psychological environment. And so the impact of ongoing change for our workforce also needs to be considered. Some other factors to consider are how much of this adaptation process during isolation and through to reintegration are related to the individual themselves, organisational factors, or relationship factors. Now, some of you who have heard me speak before may already know the answer that I'm going to give, but I invite those who perhaps haven't had the opportunity to think about this or have, maybe had direct experience in your role in the workplace. Which factors are those most likely to impact employee adaptation at this time? Is it factors about the individual themselves, how they cope, their age, their personality? Is it factors about the workplace, be it organisational structure, policies, procedures? Or is it relationships, not just with work colleagues, but also with important others in the employee's life? So again, I invite you, if you've not done so already, to follow the link, indicate which you think might be the most influential, and we'll move on in a couple of moments. For a range of responses, and one thing is the reality is your answer to that question will be influenced by your direct experiences, and every workplace is different. However, what we consistently find, regardless of workplace, is that how well an individual employee adapts post-isolation, during reintegration, is actually a combination of factors about themselves as an individual, so things like personality, things like coping style, even things like previous experience. There's also relationship dynamics. So an employee who has significant others in their lives who are supportive of their work role will much more readily adapt and reintegrate than those who have important others who may be less supportive of the work role. And organisational climate. We recognise that's always a key determining factor across a number of psychological health and safety domains. But as you'll see from this model of adaptation, which is based on the research that I've conducted, particularly with Antarctic expeditioners, what we consistently find is that when people experience good social support from colleagues, leaders, and important others, along with information sharing and effective communication, again, from those same outlets of colleagues, leaders, and important others. This increases trust in themselves in terms of their ability to cope, trust that the important others in their lives care about them and want the best for them. And importantly for us in this context, trust in the organisation, that the organisation is also connected to, committed to providing an environment that allows them to thrive. As I've already flagged, during this reintegration process, most people underestimate the challenges that it brings. And that's actually why the data shows us that this is the most difficult phase of the isolation experience, because people aren't prepared for it. Now that the isolation itself is over, so the challenges. What is important for us to know is that the strongest predictors, so the organisational, individual, and relationship factors that predict adaptation, actually relate to what was going on before the isolation experience and during the reintegration experience. In other words, although the isolation itself could have been very, very difficult, we actually have the ability to shape reintegration based on the environment we provide when they return. The other important integration is that it is not a quick fix. This is a process. It takes months. And the data we have suggests that if people are required to undertake further isolation before they're fully reintegrated, that this can compound the challenges and prolong the reintegration experience. So when we think about environments that have experienced repeated lockdowns, for example, we know that their reintegration trajectory will be quite different and quite prolonged. And it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. People's rate of adaptation, the types of emotions they will experience and exhibit, will vary depending on the number of changes they're trying to navigate. So yes, coming back to work itself is change. But for most of us, the work environment that people are returning to has also changed. It's not the exact same place they left. And so there's another layer of change that's being negotiated. What this essentially means is that you are likely to have a workforce that has people at very different stages of adaptation and reintegration, even if they ostensibly commence that process at the same time. And so some people will move through quite rapidly, others less so, and others may seem to have a prolonged roller coaster. So that reverse culture shock might seem to happen in waves. Again, the big message here is that we need to have the flexibility to accommodate these different outcomes, as well as protect and promote organisational objectives during these times. So what might these trajectories look like? Depending on a range of factors, you're likely to see three main responses when people first start to re-enter a physical work site. One will be apprehension, and that apprehension can be due to a concern about what the expectations might be, and maybe that there will be an increased workload to try and make up for lost time. It might be apprehension about to do work a different way. Many people develop new ways of working when working remotely. So essentially, they either need to learn their old patterns or develop new patterns once back on site. Another source of apprehension can actually be around ongoing risk of community transmission, particularly if you have vulnerable groups or people in the home who are within a vulnerable group. In contrast, you are also going to see people incredibly excited to come back together as a workforce. And these people are more likely to be those individuals for whom work is a primary source of identity. And what can happen is when you have apprehensive individuals needing to interact with very excited individuals, is that it can actually polarize one another further. So the apprehensive individual can become more apprehensive because they feel overwhelmed by the behaviour of the excited person. And the excited person can feel frustrated and maybe even disappointed in the apprehensive individual's seeming lack of engagement. Then we have a group in the middle who are a bit of both, and maybe it even depends for them on the day. But generally speaking, where there is flexibility to determine when to come back on site, the excited people will be there first, the apprehensive people much later. We also know that stage of career has a very big impact here. So particularly for early to mid-career individuals, there is a perceived need to make up for lost time. And a really important message for these individuals is that no time was lost compared to anybody else. The purpose of isolation is survival rather than strategic developmental workplace outcomes. And so keeping an eye on those individuals, particularly again, if they are highly perfectionistic, because these individuals could be at increased risk of burnout by overcompensating when they come back on site. We know that the literature has been quite clear, the research has been quite clear that there has been a differential impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on traditional female roles and traditional male roles, and in particular a concern that for those individuals occupying a caregiving role, which stereotypically remains a female-oriented role in our current society, will have had greater negative impact on their careers than those without those caregiving experiences. Similarly, we know that single individuals who are more likely to have weathered isolation completely on their own will have different needs to those who have shared the isolation experience with others in their household. One thing I do want to draw out here, and it won't come as a surprise to most people, but if there are unresolved workplace issues, challenges, or even problems before isolation, they won't have gone away. They may not immediately re-emerge. There may be a brief honeymoon period, like on that slide I showed before about reverse culture shock. However, they will re-emerge. And an important difference is that people's cognitive capacity to deal with these has changed, and generally not for the better. I'm not going to spend too long on this next slide, except to just flag that another key differentiating feature for people who are navigating this reintegration experience are whether they take the role of an observer who essentially will wait for others to guide them, a survivor who can identify their own role in change but feel disempowered in this process, and as a result might take a somewhat more defensive or self-protective approach to change. And of course the navigator, who are individuals who believe they are not only capable but also have the resources to influence their experience. Now, ideally, we love for all employees to be navigators, but again, we recognise there may be observers and survivors. Understanding that these individuals' reintegration experience will take longer is an important consideration. So with all of this uncertainty, how do we manage this? Earlier I said that, for most people, they're looking for predictability, because when the world is predictable, they feel more in control. And when they feel more in control, their anxiety goes down. So how does that work when so much uncertainty remains? This is really tricky. But essentially what we need to support colleagues to do is to let go of the things that are out of their control and redirect those efforts and energies into activities, behaviours that are in your control and over which you do have some influence. And this is because if people continue to exert energy over factors they have no control, that's actually going to increase their distress, because it just enhances that sense of helplessness and hopelessness. What can help, however, is the development of some routines for that idea of predictability, and being able to accept the idea that nothing will ever be 100% predictable. But that's neither good nor bad. It's simply different. And that's hard because, again, our brain tries to take shortcuts. And if it can quickly categorize things as good, then we don't need to worry, we forget about them. Or bad, this is a danger, focus on this, direct your energies to this. It actually, misses that shade of grey, which is where we can truly exert some important change. So again, something I'm briefly just touching on, and you're welcome to go back to the recording to look over this in more detail, is the challenges of change can leave people feeling disoriented, disidentified, disenchanted, and disengaged. And so our main role is to create conditions in which these factors and experiences may still occur, but they will not dominate the experience. There's a lot of text on this slide, but really what I want you to take away from it is the role of social support in developing a resilient workforce at both the individual as well as the organisational level. When people have networks in which they trust, they feel safe, validated, and understood, then they are much more able, but importantly, willing to weather challenges because they see that as both meaningful and gives them a sense of purpose. And when people derive a sense of meaning and purpose from their work role, that in turn further enhances resilience. So whilst we recognise social support is good and having people who understand our experience is of benefit, we do need to understand that it can't be too narrow. Where possible and plausible, if we can facilitate interactions from people within the same workplace, or maybe if it's small workplaces from the same industry, where there is already that baseline shared understanding, but at the same time, an opportunity for new perspectives, new ideas, and experiences, that increases cognitive flexibility. So in other words, it increases people's ability to think about multiple perspectives and multiple outcomes. And that too decreases distress, increases resilience, and enhances adaptation. So what are some core behaviours we can be modelling to those in our workplaces to facilitate resilience, adaptation, and ultimately performance? Because when we have a resilient workforce who are able to adapt, then we maximise performance. One way is through critical thinking. And this is the idea of yes, think clearly, yes, think logically, evaluate the evidence for and against, but importantly, recognise the multiple possible answers in doing so. We're modelling cognitive flexibility. We're also creating an environment in which it's safe for people to take risks, to make a suggestion that could enhance the overall organisational performance. We need to be okay with ambiguity, so uncertainty, and understand that sometimes we will be making decisions on available information, and that available information might change. That doesn't make the decision wrong. It simply means the information or the situation changed, which results in a need to reevaluate decision making. Empathy. Now, empathy is not feeling sorry for others. It's not sympathy. It's the ability to take others' perspectives and recognise that people have different experiences and different contributions to make, and all are not just valuable, but are actually vital to outcomes. And courage. Now, in this context, courage is being able to take a risk and know that it might not work out, and that in itself does not mean failure, because the taking of the risk facilitated you pass the pain.
Kimberley, a question has come through.
Sure.
Yes. So the question is, can we, or how can we encourage workers to be navigators instead of observers and survivors?
That is such an important question. I'm so glad it was brought up. Part of it is actually this idea of developing cognitive flexibility. So what we find with observers and survivors is that they essentially filter information to fit with their pre-existing ideas, their pre-existing beliefs. And remembering that in this particular instance, their pre-existing ideas and pre-existing beliefs are quite negative. that things are bad. So this idea of cognitive flexibility, helping them to recognise that nothing is ever 100% good, but nor is it 100% bad. And that this in and of itself is a key part of the workspace is really important. So I realise that's still quite abstract, so I'm just going to drill down a little bit further. When we have individuals who are observers, individuals who are survivors, we can take an opportunity to reflect on previous experiences. And you can do this at a group level in a team meeting, or you can do it at an individual level. But the idea is you get them to reflect on their past successes and you explore what made this a success. How did you know it was a success? And they'll come out with all these outcomes and okay, and what facilitated that outcome? What allowed you to do those things? And then they go through this process of reliving the brainstorming, of recognising that it was collaborative. Then you say, did everything go according to plan? Or were there some unexpected hiccups along the way? Or other things that made it challenging but still successful? And so essentially what you're doing is you are modelling the navigator. You're modelling that they're thinking of success as everything's good. So you allow them to explore that, allow them to see that it's successful, and then open up that experience to recognise that didn't necessarily make it easy, that success can come despite challenge. And so you as the role model, you as modelling the navigator, are essentially guiding them through that process. The other things that will help with that idea of developing the navigator as opposed to the observer or survivor are in these following slides. So overarchingly, we want to develop a culture of resilience where people will speak up, even if it means it's in dissent. The idea that when there is a problem flagged or an issue raised, you problem solve rather than dismiss. If issues are dismissed, that decreases trust and increases those defensive responses of survivors and that fear of helplessness of observers. So the idea is, okay, talk me through your worry. Where does that come from? How can we proactively manage that? So in other words, we recognise it's possible, we proactively manage it. When we are sharing difficult news, because so many of us have had to do that during this particular pandemic, there have been massive impacts on our workforce. We need to do so in a way that's manageable and avoids burden. So in other words, we need to communicate, we need to make the issue clear, but we often need to have either already developed the solution and be able to articulate that. So the message then becomes, here's an issue, we've got it, or come with some or a range of possible options that then the team feels able to have input into. And basically, which way you go will depend on the nature of the issue at hand and the size of your workforce. But the idea is we don't want our individual employees feeling that they have to solve this problem. We also need to get into a better habit of acknowledging the contributions and efforts of everybody, not just those leading the challenge or leading the charge. Yes, there absolutely have been people who have gone above and beyond, and they should be recognised. But the reality is, every single one of our employees has gone above and beyond, and they all need to be recognised as well. The power of that validation is really important for particularly the observer, because suddenly to say to them, you've created this positive outcome, you've achieved these things diminishes that sense of helplessness. And for the survivor, rather than feeling like they have to protect against the next wave, it helps them to open up and sit with that achievement. So again, how do we facilitate that navigator? With clear, contemporaneous communication. So what that means is we need to, within appropriate constraints, communicate our plans to allow preparation for the challenge. And in this preparation, we need to avoid unrealistic optimism, either by ourselves saying everything's going to be okay, because no one can ever guarantee that. But similarly, if we see within our workforce people who have unrealistically positive expectations, we need to moderate those so there's not a sense of loss if they do not come to fruition. The other reason we need that clear contemporaneous communication is to override some of the rumour mills that occur, and particularly for those organisations where remote working or a blended model is still in play, we have found that those rumour mills actually have intensified because there hasn't been the opportunity to quell them like there normally would be when people have that direct face-to-face engagement. As part of this communication plan, some people will want a well-documented written plan that they can refer back to. And part of that's that idea of cognitive load. They can't keep everything in their head, so if they've got it tangible, it feels safer. Whereas there could possibly be some opportunities for some greater flexibility in some domains. And when you're providing solutions, do have those for the large scale items and invite contributions for others on the smaller to medium scale items. And I keep coming back to it, but it's so important. Focus your attention and strategies on the things that you can control. And again, if we take that back to the observer, to the survivor, and to the navigator. If the observer is spending their energy on things outside their control, that's going to enhance that sense of helplessness. If they redirect that energy onto things that is in their control, that decreases helplessness. Similarly, with a survivor, if they spend their energy on things that are outside their control, you're going to see increasing defensiveness because they're feeling like they're not being valued, they're feeling under threat. If we can help redirect their energies to things that are inside their control, again, it facilitates that acknowledgement of achievement, brings down those defences, excuse me, and encourages them closer to that navigator role. The other thing that I have said before, and I've found resonates quite strongly with a number of employees, is the idea of taking risk with a purpose. When employees believe that risks are just taken for the sake of it, they don't feel safe. They can't trust. If we take risks with a purpose and communicate that purpose, it actually increases that sense of meaning, commitment, and loyalty that lead to resilient outcomes. So here are some tangible things that you can also be doing. As you bring your workplace community back together, create opportunities rather than mandates to re-establish this connection in a gradual manner. Because remember, those excited individuals will be straight onto it, wanting to be part of it. However, those more apprehensive individuals could be quite readily overwhelmed. So creating opportunities where they can dip their toe in, if you like, and then gradually become more used to it is going to result in better adaptation across the board. Similarly, because those excited individuals will then have an opportunity to connect in the way that they're looking to, that will also help their reintegration. We need to recognise, but also help our colleagues recognise, that staff are likely to be at different points on that reintegration roller coaster, and that that's normal, and that all people can be accommodated and supported along that process. To help manage particularly individuals with those perfectionistic traits and those in their earlier to mid-career phase, we need to work hard to set achievable and appropriate goals and expectations. This provides a really clear set of parameters where people will know if they're meeting the required outcomes, and similarly reassure others that they are. To manage the cognitive load, provide written summaries of key actions and actions that are occurring, because people just won't be able to remember it all. Acknowledge and validate the efforts of all. And this actually aligns with a reinforcement principle, so alongside learning theory, which says when people are rewarded for a behaviour, they are much more likely to continue or repeat that behaviour. If that behaviour is essentially in their mind ignored, there's no strong motivation to continue. Another component, and this is a tricky one, but wherever possible, we do want to encourage people to take some leave. And the reason for that is that it actually creates a space where they can process their experiences of isolation, coming back to work, and facilitate recovery along that reintegration profile. Now, when I talk about leave, it doesn't necessarily have to be big blocks of time. It could be taking 3 or 4 day weekends, maybe a couple in a row, maybe some spread out. But the idea is we want people to recognise that work time is for work and non-work time is for non-work activities. And that idea of protecting non-work activities feeds back into some of those earlier benefits of isolation around self-care and growth. And I think it's really important because I am aware that most of the people here will have a role that necessitates and requires support of other colleagues. And what I want to say is that it's really important to provide the opportunities we've been talking about today, but it's never your sole responsibility to take care of every individual. You also need to acknowledge your own achievements and make time to protect those things that rest, relax, and re-energise you. Similarly, take some leave. Because again, when people in positions like HR, like leadership, at all levels, start demonstrating these behaviours, a couple of things happen. One, you actually become more effective at what you do. Two, people will start to see this as normal and welcomed within the work environment. And as a result, give themselves permission to do the things we know will help them. And this idea of self-care, you know, it can be a really, really tricky one because not a lot of people are familiar with it. But there are some ideas on the slide there. Things that help to rest, relax, and re-energise. Even just now, if I just get you all to just take a deep breath in, just hold it there, and breathe out. That in itself can be so powerful. It slows down your heart rate, slows down your breathing rate, and as a result, slows down how quickly everything's happening in your brain. Just helps you to remember. Take time to breathe. The other thing, and it leads back to one of the challenges of isolation, is that we are all more than our job. Our job is important to us and it helps define who we are. But people who are able to generate self-complexity, so in other words, excuse me, recognize all the different aspects of who they are and what they do. What this means is if there's ever a threat or a challenge to any particular aspect of identity, there's still heaps to rest back on. So if during isolation, people are more than an employee, that will help them get through that process. Now, it doesn't mean the absence of being an employee. It means the addition to that aspect of identity. And to build self-complexity, to build different facets of identity, takes risks, takes exploration, finding meaning and purpose. And you can see that there's a very circular argument happening with what I'm talking about today. Purpose, meaning, connection, resilience. So with that, I'll end the seminar and welcome any questions. There is a freely available short course that the university has developed for anyone who might be interested, and you can direct anyone in the community towards that as well. It covers a lot of what we've talked about today, but also some other little activities that people might find of benefit.
Thank you, Kimberley. And if anyone does have any questions for Dr. Kimberley Norris from the University of Tasmania, please use your control panel to type and submit your questions. So a question, Kimberley, would you worry that taking leave might make someone fall behind on the readjustment process and therefore isolated in another manner?
That's a really good question, and it's actually one we've been able to test with some of our research. So what we've found is that people who take leave actually are able to, in a way, catch up on the reintegration process, providing that the workplace that they're re-entering is aware and has those supports in place. So a workplace that has a gradual reintegration process, a workplace that has a sense of value for the individual, it won't actually delay their reintegration, it can actually help it, because otherwise what can happen is if people continue to try and work, at those very high levels, the reintegration process is actually stalled because the energy they need to reintegrate is being spent in other domains.
Thank you, Kimberley. And just to remind everyone, there is a handout sitting in your handouts window on your control panel. So there's still time to download that resource in respect to today's presentation, The Path Back from Isolation, Enhancing Employee Wellbeing and Performance Post-COVID-19. Just to remind everyone, today's webinar has also been recorded and will be made available on the WorkSafe Tasmania YouTube channel in the coming days. With no further questions coming through, Kimberley, I'll begin to close today's presentation. So thank you, Dr. Kimberley Norris from the University of Tasmania, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, The Path Back from Isolation, Enhancing Employee Wellbeing and Performance Post-COVID-19. At the close of this webinar, you will receive a survey to complete. We do appreciate you providing us with your feedback. Today's webinar has also been recorded and will be made available on the WorkSafe Tasmania YouTube channel. On behalf of WorkSafe Tasmania and the WorkCover Tasmania Board, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Kimberley Norris.
Thank you.